Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are now moving to the afternoon shift, thesis defense. I would like to introduce once again the procedure of the thesis oral defense before proceeding to the next agenda. Each thesis defense will last for 30 minutes. The defense will begin with a 15-minute presentation done by the student, followed by another 15-minute question and answer, or feedback from the supervisor and the examiner. In case that there will be a remaining time within these 15 minutes, our team will randomly select the sent by our audience, who will be commenting the questions on our Facebook Live to ask the student, and the student will accordingly answer those questions. After the entire 30-minute presentation and Q&A, one thesis defense is finished, and the next agenda will be proceeded. The first presentation this afternoon will be presented by Ms. Chey Nalin, who is from class E4.2. Nalin is majoring in international relations, and her thesis topic is rationales behind Russia's intensified relations with Cambodia. The supervisor on this topic is lecturer On Sum Nang, and the examiner is lecturer Nyan Boradain. You may now come to deliver your presentation, Nalin, and good luck.
Okay, so good afternoon lecturer and good afternoon everyone. So my name is Nalin and I'm here to present to all of you about my thesis under the topic of the rationales behind Russia's intensified relations with Cambodia. So this is my content. So in this presentation I will mainly cover 7 main points. So without further delay, let's take a look at the introduction first. So the relations between Cambodia and Russia was not strong, not significant enough after the Cold War ended because of the very limited role of Russia play in cooperation and development assistance in Cambodia. However, since 2015, there have been a few turning points in the relations between both countries, and in the years of 2015 itself, there was an official visit of the Russian Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev to Cambodia for the very first time in the history of bilateral relations between the two countries. And what is even more significant and what is even more important is the fact that following up the visit of the Russian Prime Minister, there were many memorandum of understanding signing between the two counterparts. Like for example, in 2017, 6 bilateral legal documents were signed between the two counterparts, and this made up to a total of 45 bilateral documents in 2015. And moreover, there has also been a frequent exchange of delegations between the two counterparts, and the leaders of both countries have also met on the sideline of meeting very frequently as well. And because of this particular reason, because of the efforts of Russia in strengthening ties with Cambodia, and because of the remarkable improvement in the relations between the two countries, it ultimately posed a question: what are the rationales behind Russia's intensified relations with Cambodia? And in order to answer the main research question is broken down into 2 sub-research questions. The first one is what is the most influential factor bringing Russia closer to Cambodia, and another one is to what extent will Cambodia help Russia achieving his foreign policy objective. So before we actually move to the result analysis part, we have to look at the existing literature review in order to get a general perspective on the topic first. So the literature review in this thesis is divided into 2 main sections. The first one is the theoretical framework on foreign policy restructuring, and this first section mainly look at various explanations by different scholars on the rationale behind the change of the pattern of external relations of the state with other countries. And from the existing literature review, there are 2 common factors that actually push states to restructure their foreign policy. And those 2 factors include the external factor and the domestic factor. And from the existing literature review, many authors have used many cases in order to justify their argument. However, none has specifically focused on Russia. So in this case, I believe that the specific case should also be studied. And for the second sections of the literature review, focus on Cambodia and Russia relations in Cold War to the post-Cold War period. And from the existing literature review, the author have only provided a general perspective or a general explanations on the evolution of Cambodia and Russia relations. However, none of the existing study has seeks to provide an in-depth analysis on Cambodia and Russia relations, especially regarding to the motive of Russia in his closer move to Cambodia. And because of this particular reason, this thesis is significant for three main reasons. So first of all, this paper will seek to fill the existing literature gap on Cambodia and Russia relations by offering an analytical analysis on the motive of Russia in his closer move to Cambodia. And second, this paper is significant as it will shed more light on the relations between small state and big state, like how the small state like Cambodia can be beneficial to a big state like Russia. And last but not least, this paper can be used as a literature review for further study related to Cambodia and Russia relations. So with the research question in mind, this paper seeks to examine the rationale behind Russia's intensified relation with Cambodia through the lens of neoclassical realism. And in order to achieve the research objective, this paper employs a qualitative approach in which semi-structured interview, primary sources and secondary sources collection will be collected in order to provide an in-depth analysis on the topic. And in order to analyze the rationale of Russia, this paper used neoclassical realism as a framework for analysis. So the neoclassical realism here actually developed by Gideon Rose, and the theory here mentions that the foreign policy of the state is first and foremost driven by the external factor. However, we cannot deny the fact that the domestic factor as well as the subjective attitude of the state, which include the leader factor, can also cast an influence on foreign policy of the state as well. So with these three factors influence on the foreign policy of the state will adopt a new foreign policy, in which the new foreign policy itself will somehow affect the external factor to some extent. So before we move to the result analysis part, this paper hypothesized that the intensification of Russia relations with Cambodia is actually beyond the revitalization of traditional relations. And this because the intensifying of relations of Russia relations with Cambodia is made with the ultimate objective of achieving his foreign policy objective embedded in his turn to the East policy. And this paper further hypothesized that the level of intensification of Russia relations with Cambodia is based on the commitment of Russia to achieve his foreign policy objective. So in this case, if Russia is very committed in achieving his foreign policy objective, then the better relation with Cambodia will be. However, if Russia put less commitment, and then the relation between Cambodia and Russia will go back to normal. So let's take a look at the finding and discussion part. So the first part of the finding and discussion here will seek to answer the first sub-research question, which is what is the most influential factor bringing Russia closer to Cambodia. And in order to actually answer the first sub-research question, this paper employed a neoclassical realism by looking at three different factors. So let's start with the external factor. So for the external factor, the NATO expansion, which resulted in the response of Russia to annex Crimea in 2014, as well as the case of the drowning of the flight MH17, actually put the relations between Russia and the West into a worsening relations because of the sanctions imposed on Russia after these two issues happened. And this actually pushed Russia to adopt turn to the East policy with the foreign policy objective to ward off Western political pressure. And this actually leads to the intensification of relations with Cambodia, because Cambodia can offer support for Russia to ward off Western political pressure through the role of Cambodia in international state to some extent. And for the domestic factor, on the other hand, the domestic economic loss resulted from the drop in oil price as well as resulted from the sanctions imposed on Russia actually lead Russia to find an alternative market, which is an Asian market. And moreover, Russia has also desired to develop Siberia and the Russian Far East as well. And in order to bring this goal into reality, Russia has to integrate the regions into Asian market. And because of these two important domestic issues, it actually led Russia to adopt turn to the East policy with different policy objective to bring about ASEAN and EAEU free trade agreement into reality. And this ultimately leads to the intensification of relations with Cambodia, because Cambodia is a member state of ASEAN, can act as a gateway for Russia and his EAEU bloc into ASEAN. And for the last part is about the leader factor. So under Putin administration, Russia has never once abandoned his great power aspirations. And this can be seen in the foreign policy concept of Russia in 2000 and in 2016 respectively. So with Asia Pacific becoming the centers of geopolitical competitions, Putin has to engage Russia in the regions in order to further show off his good leadership skill as well as in order to further spread his influence. And moreover, under the third tenures of Putin administrations, the foreign policy of Russia has been directed at the Asian vector, in which he has a good perception of Cambodia, in which President Putin himself views Cambodia as a reliable and dependable partner in the regions. And in order for Russia to actually fulfill his great power aspiration, it has led Russia to adopt turn to the East policy, and this led to the intensification of relations with Cambodia to some extent. So from this analysis, we can see that these three factors actually contribute to the intensification of relations with Cambodia. However, this paper contends that the leader factor is the most influential factor in bringing Russia closer to Cambodia, because the foreign policy decision making center on the president office with President Putin as the ultimate decision maker, and this is rooted in the Constitution of Russia, Article 80 and Article 85. So in this case, if President Putin still want to achieve a great power aspiration, and if President Putin still hold a good perception of Cambodia, and then it will lead to the intensification of relations with Cambodia to some extent. So that is all for the first part of analysis. For the second part of analysis, to seek to answer the second sub-research question. So the first part is about Cambodia as a supporter for Russia in international state. So we know that Russia has adopted turn to the East policy with the foreign policy objective to ward off Western political pressures. And through the engagement with Cambodia, Cambodia can actually offer support for Russia to ward off Western political pressure through the role of Cambodia in the United Nations as well as the chairmanship of ASEM in 2020. So through the United Nations platform, Cambodia can offer support for Russia to ward off Western political pressure to some extent by voting against two draft resolutions of UNGA targeting Russia. And second, Cambodia can further offer support for Russia to ward off Western political pressure through the role of Cambodia as the host of ASEM. So in this case, Cambodia can seek to prevent the issues that is deemed to be sensitive to Russia to be included in the agenda. And that is how Cambodia to some extent can offer support for Russia to ward off Western political pressure. And second is about Cambodia as a facilitator in helping Russia easing domestic difficulty. So again, we know that Russia has adopted turn to the East policy with the foreign policy objective to bring about ASEAN and EAEU free trade agreement into reality. And through the engagement with Cambodia, Cambodia can actually facilitate the goal of bringing about ASEAN and EAEU free trade agreement into reality by helping to promote a good perception of EAEU within the region. So in this case, Cambodia can further help to promote a good perception of Cambodia, to good perception of EAEU through through the attempt to forge Cambodia and EAEU free trade agreement, as well as hosting Cambodia and EAEU business forum. So the success of hosting the business forum here actually make EAEU more appealing to the regions, as it signifies the possible cooperations between EAEU and ASEAN bloc. And Cambodia can further help Russia to promote a good perception of EAEU through the role of Cambodia as the ASEM chairmanship as well. And for the third part is about Cambodia as a catalyst in pushing Russia closer to his great power aspiration. So through the engagement with Cambodia, Russia can actually show off his great power skill in three ways. So first of all, through the engagement with Cambodia, Russia can show off his good image through the Russian-Cambodian debt conversion. Second, he can further show off his leadership skill in the region through his leading role in energy sector by helping Cambodia to overcome the energy challenges. And through the engagement with Cambodia, Russia can further show off his good leadership skill through the positions of Cambodia as a chairman, as the ASEM chairmanship as well. And last but not least, Cambodia, through the engagement with Cambodia, Russia can further spread his regional and global influence easier through the help of Cambodia as a member of the United Nations, as well as the ASEAN chairmanship in 2020. So last but not least, Cambodia is also a reliable partner of Russia in terms of countering terrorism, in terms of market, as well as in terms of investment as well. So this is the summary of the finding. So we can see that these three factors actually push Russia to adopt the turn to the East policy. And the turn to the East policy here leads to the intensification of relation with Cambodia, and through the intensification of relation with Cambodia, Russia can achieve this particular foreign policy objective. So in conclusions, the the intensification of Russia relation with Cambodia is actually beyond the revitalization of the traditional relations, because Russia has chosen to intensify his relation with Cambodia with the objective of achieving his turn to the East policy, including warding off Western political pressure, bringing about ASEAN and EAU free trade agreement into reality, and to achieve his great power aspirations. And through the role of Cambodia as a facilitator for Russia, especially through the role of Cambodia as ASEAN chairmanship and as ASEAN chairmanship, it actually facilitates the progress of attending foreign policy of Russia faster. And even though this paper actually employs a neoclassical realism as a framework for analysis, there are still some others underlying factors in each main variable that this paper haven't been discovered. So I would like to suggest the future researcher to take this aspect into consideration. And last but not least, I would like to also suggest the future researcher to try to get access to a large number of respondents, as many as possible, in order to ensure a comprehensiveness as well as an analytical arguments of the paper. Thank you. That's all for my presentation.
I have several questions and comments, but let me start with one statement. Okay? Do you agree with the statement that, based on the geographical reality of Russia, Russia has to focus on its western border? Okay? If you look at the Far East, what is the largest city in the Far East? How many cities in the Far East that has more than 1 million people? Okay, so given the fact that Russia has limited resources, they have to focus on the western border. So that fundamental statement, would you agree with that, or do you think it's not accurate?
I would like to ask for a clarification regarding this question. So you mean that Russia has mostly focused on the west side rather than Asia, right? And do I agree with this statement? Okay, thank you, lecturer, for this question. So in my perspective, according to my observations, I believe that the foreign policy of Russia still mostly focused on the West. So just because Russia has adopted turn to the East policy here, it doesn't mean that Russia has completely turned away from the West. So because of this particular reason, I kind of agree with your statement.
So in that case, how can the East be used? Yeah, there are several questions that follow from that. So the first one is, how can the East be used to alleviate the pressure from the West? I mean, you've got problems in the West. Why don't you stay and resolve it? Why do you get away from that and try to cooperate with people in the East? While the East has really little strategic interest in you, why don't you focus all of your resources to the West?
Okay, thank you, lecturer, for the answer. So I believe that Russia has adopted turn to the East policy here is because the relations between Russia and the West is in a worsening relations, because there are many misunderstandings happen between the two. And moreover, Russia has also been feeling dissatisfied with the Western structure, especially in regard to expansion. So in this case, I believe that Russia has adopted turn to the East policy here because he wanted to find an alternative partner in order to reduce dependency with the West, especially in the future.
So why don't Russia just focus all of the resources to improve relations with countries like Moldova, improve relations with Ukraine, improve relations with the Baltic states, improve relations with the Scandinavian countries? Why divert resources, precious resources that are very limited, to the country that would not have anything to say in terms of NATO expansion? I mean, if you want to block the NATO expansion, you've got to talk to countries like Belarus, like Moldova, these former Soviet republics. So why? I just wonder why they spend money on somewhere else and not the people who stand at the border of NATO expansion. And the reason I ask this question because it will lead to another question, which is countries have relations. How do you know that the relationship between Cambodia and Russia is the one that is so special? Okay. And another question that is followed from that logic is that Russia intensify relations with Cambodia, or Cambodia intensify relations with Russia. Who started it first? Okay. Let me, what is the role of Cambodia? I mean, let me get out all the questions that related to each other. Like Cambodia, I am Cambodian. I'm really proud when we say that Cambodia is precious. But as a realist, we have to be realistic. In terms of material power, we are a small state. So normally in international relations, if you're a realist, the small state has to go to the big state. Okay, it's small state that starts first. So I still wonder whether we are really so precious to Russia. And in terms of evidence, like Cambodia votes against some draft that condemn Russia, for example. Without Cambodia, would it make any difference at all? Let's say Cambodia abstain or even vote against Russia. Would that make any difference? And then there's another issue like the ASEAN. The intensified relation occurred in 2015. If I understand correctly, the fact that we will become as a host was after 2015. So that could not be possible that the ASEAN championship become something that is in the Russian calculation. So all of these questions and comments just make me center on the my disagreement that I really wonder whether this is just normal state-to-state relation. It's just normal state-to-state relation, and not really something that is, we might say, earth-shattering. Okay, that is not an earthquake. It's just just normal relation. All right. So, do you have any concrete evidence that Russia really shifted their resources to the east, and that the east really played a role that made a difference? Anything that made a difference instead of just normal relations. Do you have any evidence on that?
Particularly, Russia has shifted his foreign policy in the recent years into East Asia, or into Asia Pacific, or into ASEAN specifically, mainly because of the worsening relations between Russia and the West. And I believe that the ASEAN or the Asia Pacific as a whole actually can benefit economically for Russia. And because of this particular reason, Russia has to turn to the east, because turn to the east, he will not only help Russia to alleviate economic domestic loss, because ASEAN or Asia Pacific now is a growing market in which ASEAN GDP combined together made up to a total of $2.3 trillion, which surpasses of the UK. And because ASEAN as well as Asia Pacific market is growing remarkably, Russia has to make a turn to Asia in order to export his arms, as well as the energies in which the ASEAN market is lacking of the energy supply. And because of this reason, I believe that Asia Pacific or ASEAN as a whole is quite important to Russia in terms of economic. And I believe that related to the another thing is related to the NATO expansion. You said it would be better if Russia has actually put resources in order to solve, or in order to make the relation a good relation with Ukraine rather than coming to the east. And I would like to say that the NATO expansion here actually expand also included the Baltic state as well as the Georgia, and they wanted to also include Ukraine. So in this case, Russia has actually spent some resources in order to stop the NATO expansions by annexing Crimea. So this is according to the speech of President Putin, in which he stated that if Russia does nothing, the West will definitely take Ukraine in. And because of this particular reason, he spent some resources in order to annex Ukraine in 2014. And that is how he tried to actually stop the NATO expansions.
I agree with the Ukraine thing, but I still it's not wrong. But I feel like it feels like it is more hypothetical than an actual evidence. I think for me, at least I would probably need some concrete evidence. For example, is that Southeast Asia is a big defense market for defense industry for Russia. What is the number compared to other areas?
I haven't researched regarding to the defense sector, but I have looked at the energy sector. So for the energy sector, for the predictions, the Asia Pacific market or the Asia Pacific demands of energy will rise up to around 60 or 40% in the futures, and
what is the Russian market share in their expansion?
The Russian market share is around 10 to 20%, if I'm not wrong.
What is who owns the other 70 or 80%?
Particularly the West.
Yeah, so, and all of the energy that Russia sold to Southeast Asia accounts for how many percentage of the thing that Russia sold to Western Europe? And let me give you one concrete evidence as to the problem that people in Russia are using. Last year in Thailand, there was the defense minister's meeting. I was there, but you can also check our open source. There's supposed to be ministerial meeting, 1 plus 10, 10 plus 1, between the defense minister of ASEAN plus some major defense minister. Russia decided to send a minor official, which is a deputy minister. There seems to be a sentiment among the ASEAN countries that that was an insult. So Thailand, as the host, decided to cancel their meeting. And they're right there. I think this evidence against this policy of turn to peace. If you really turn to peace, send your minister, but don't send it. They don't even send the minister that used to come. They send another minister which is a minor official. And ASEAN consider that to be an insult. And that is direct evidence against that. Because there is this fundamental geopolitical reality that Russia has to focus on the West. They got sanctions from the Western countries. So, if you say that Russia really turned to peace, you really need a lot of evidence. I think that is the bottom line of my comments.
Lecturer, I would like to raise another concrete evidence as well. So, so since the announcement of Russia's turn to the East policy, President Putin has reaffirmed his policy by attending many Asia Pacific as well as Asian multilateral platforms too. Like he hosted the APEC summit. He hosted the APEC in 2012, and he also attended the Asian Defense Ministerial meeting, and he also attended the East Asia Summit as well. And in those summits, he actually met with our Prime Minister at the sideline of 4 meetings. The first one is at the Asian and Russia Summit in Sochi, and the first one and another one is in East Asia Summit, and another one is in the third Asian and Russia Summit. And another one is in ASEAN Brussels, at the sideline of the ASEAN Brussels. So in this case, I
all that in 1 year?
No, in different years. One in 2016, one in 2018, and another one is in 2019.
Where in 2019?
Only 2017 and 2018. Yes, ASEAN Brussels in 2018, and the third Asian and Russia Summit in 2017, and the East Asia Summit is also in 2017 as well.
The point is, it's not consistent. Like last year, it's not come. So the point is, it's not consistent. That's my point.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, lecturer program for your contribution to the comment for the thesis of nalin. I'm highly appreciated, and meanwhile, I also would like to intervene in order to help nalin to defend his thesis. We still believe that Cambodia is significant to Russia, and the hypothesis nalin made is mainly try to explain the reasons why Russia intensified relation to Cambodia, and it does not explore much about why Russia turned to the east. But it means that somehow we can explain that Cambodia is significant to Russia once the condition that Russia focused much on the objective of attaining its policy. And regarding the first doubtfulness about Russia foreign policy on the west or east, I do support that Russia prioritize the Western policy as the most important one. But according to various scholars, especially by assessed by the West, over the last 5 years, foreign policy focusing in the West is the failures of Russia. And this assessed by professor in EU and the US. It said that over the last 5 years, Russia has failed to achieve its Western foreign policy. And then what is significant for Russia to turn to Asia, because I think much is the sanctions and the sour relation or moving backwards between Russia and the US after elections. Because after the elections in 2016, Putin's or other Russians elites believe that the relationship will go to normal, and the sanctions will be gradually spread out, but it is in the opposite way. So the first foreign policy is the failure, and to have foreign policy more fruitful, we have the option. And I think this one is the second option after the Western is Asia Pacific. And why Russia focus much on Cambodia? I think the links already mentioned some uniqueness about Cambodia. First, we think about traditional relationship. Second, we think about less cost. We think about the friendship of some Cambodian senior officials which have graduate PhD from that and hold high position in Cambodia. So it is easy to convince or insert some motivations or suggestions for Cambodia. And what is the more important thing is that Cambodians can hold 3 different regional positions in 3 years in a row. One is Assam Championship in 2020, Assam ASEAN Championship in 2022, and the last one is ASEAN Secretariat. That's Cambodia vehicles. So during that, I think Cambodians can participate a lot. And what is the success of Russia in her foreign policy is key important role to be the mediator in the Middle East and try to turn the what we call the monopolar world into the multi-centric world. And so Asia is part of that. So I think that this is somehow Russia still focus on Asia. And what nalin tried to frame is try to conceptualize why, like Professor already mentioned, that why small state like Cambodia is so significant to Russia, and why not Cambodia as a small state need to depend on Russia. This is because of, as we can see, Russia announced because of the sanctions from the West, because of the resource, because of the frozen assets of the elite. They have limited capacity to expand for economic corporations or other benefit provided to the small state. But they see the opportunity of Cambodia as the regional, holding the regional position in the future. That's why they can post spoken. And Nalin already put condition that the intensification of this relation is depend on commitments on the his foreign policy. So once the world becomes normal, it means Russia-US relation becomes normal and the West will cooperate more. So the relations gonna become to normal or backward. But in the case that the pressure from the West is still strong, so Russia have no options but have to sit away and use cost less in order to enhance the relations with other countries. And this also promotes its image, not only in Southeast Asia, but also in other parts of the world. So this is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, lecturers, for your contributions, and thank you very much, Nalin, for the presentation. We will now have a 5 minutes break, okay, for the team to set up for the next presentation. Now I would like to introduce our next presenter. His name is U Watanadasmai. He is from class E4.3, majoring in international relations. That's my is China and defense rationality in the South China Sea. How can South China Sea benefit China in time of crisis? The supervisor is lecturer Nyan Boradan and the examiner is lecturer Nek Chandarat. That's me. You can start your presentation now and good luck.
Good afternoon, lecturer. Good afternoon. My name is Ubatana Resme and I am here to defend my thesis topic, which is China and defense rationality in South China Sea and how can China utilize the area to benefit in time of crisis. So here are my content. I will walk you through the background information of the issue before moving on to research methodology and literature review, and then present you with the finding and policy recommendation in the conclusion. So here are some background information. In fact, the problem of South China Sea is not something new. It has happened in the middle of the 20th century. Only recently, with the increasing military activity from China through the construction of artificial islands, and also meanwhile, with the United States increasing its military naval operation in the area, which in recent time has have come close, which have a close call to come close with contact with each other. Many scholars do believe that actually China and the South China Sea can be a trigger point between China and the United States for a potential military conflict. So this paper we're going to present you to formulate a possible scenario in which how can those conflicts carried out and how can the military installation which are already existing in the area will help China in such scenario. So here are the research questions. In order to formulate such scenario, this paper will mainly focus on the strategic importance and advantage of South China Sea and try to figure out and try to formulate the security objective of both China and the United States, and then formulate the possible scenario between the conflict of the two. The sub-research questions are going to focus on the political goal of both the United States and China, and also the utilization of the developed strategy of anti-access area denial and also air-sea battle between the United States and also China. So in order to formulate such scenario, this paper are going to conduct using the qualitative method through extensive inquiry into already existing academic paper and research journal, and also take the data from the official documents such as defense white paper, report, and also some already existing military doctrine, and then try to triangulate those data in order to form a possible course of action in time of crisis between the two. So this paper are mainly focused and derived from the literature review of Carbon Clausewitz on war, in which focus that in which divide war into two main parts, which is total war and limited war. This paper go with the conflict between the United States and China, going to focus on the limited war, in which the war only which fought on the frontier, and that it aimed to achieve a certain political goal. To Carbon Clausewitz, war are based on three trinities, which is the people, the government, and also the military capacity. So, in order to formulate and complement to Carbon Clausewitz, this paper is used through the strategy of A2AD, which are constantly developed by the Chinese. Actually, A2AD refers to anti-access area denial, with the main objective of deter and also to prevent a much superior force in order to enter the operational theater in the first place. To counter this, in late 2011, the U.S. Navy and Air Force had conducted and formulated a new doctrine called air-sea battle, which primarily focused on the integrated warfare of the Navy and Air Force, which aimed specifically to counter A2AD in the operational theater. The scope or limitation of this is only that this paper will focus on the recent activity between 2011 to 2019, and it will not include any possible consequences and losses, because due to time constraint and also a potential reaction from international organizations and especially from the UNSC, which means that these paper will only focus on a possible conflict scenario only. So let's move on to the research finding. What are the political goals between the United States and China in the area? For the United States, one main political goal of itself is that the preservation of the regional order. After the end of the Cold War, the United States has enjoyed itself as one of the regional hegemon, which insert order in the region through itself as a top hierarchy. So it viewed that with the China rapid modernization of its military forces, it viewed that China as a main threat. In 2017, President Donald Trump, with the Department of Defense, have changed its policy focus to put China as the main threat to its national security. This is due to the recent escalation in the East China Sea, with China wanted to insert a air defense identification zone, and the United States exclude China from the regional naval threat of RIMPAC. Also that the United States also focus on the protection of its ally interests in the region. In that, the United States constantly back up through diplomatic and military alliance. In 2017, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, with the new renewed alliance between the Philippines and the United States, has focused that the United States would come to the Philippine aid in case of China aggression on the Philippines. It also opened a new base in Singapore and also opened a new arms trade with Vietnam. So let's move on to the other side. So what does China really want? To China, actually the area of South China Sea is regarded as its sovereignty and territorial integrity. With experience of previous conflict, that China view itself through the century of humiliation, especially since the mid-20th century, after constant interference from the West in the regional affair. It has viewed that China has in need to protect its sovereignty and territory in the region. Moreover, it also views the South China Sea as a possible vulnerable point of invasion due to the experience of Opium War, and also the Chinese military have changed its defense doctrine from the coastal defense to the active defense, which is defense at the deep sea. And also in 2011, after the Pivot to Asia issued by Secretary Hillary Clinton and the Obama administration, have China fear uncertainty toward the involvement of the United States. Another main point is that China also wants to maintain its vibe with a stabilized region. In that case, China also created some diplomatic and also regional mechanisms such as the AIIB and BOI in order to support and also boost the economic cooperation between the countries in the region. So let's move on to another point. So what does South China Sea have to offer that everyone wants a piece of it? So actually, geographically speaking, South China Sea is the connector between the Western Pacific and also an Indian Ocean. To some, it can be a physical disruption of the naval reinforcement from the U.S. Naval Fleet Station in Bahrain. And most importantly, the South China Sea contains reefs in which it can be that China can construct artificial islands, and on those islands, China have used sensor reconnaissance as a surveillance facility in order to monitor all area activity, including land, including sea, air, and underwater sensor. Also, the artificial island around here are also hosted with airfield and naval station that can actually extend the range of protection and also the operational range of its navy. And before move on to actual scenario itself, we also look at the military capacity between the two countries. So during the presidency of Donald Trump, he has actually emphasized and increased the military capacity under the newly formed Indo-Pacific Command at around 370,000 personnel. In the center of that is the 7th Fleet with a carrier strike group, with stationed in Japan with one aircraft carrier, the U.S. Ronald Reagan, and accompanied by other destroyer, cruiser, and nuclear submarine. Most importantly, all those personnel are the military bases scattered around the region. Most important one is Guam, in which it hosts the airfield for a strategic bomber, tactical fighter, and also a logistic hub for naval operation that can be launched and present the firepower at will. If compared to the United States, Chinese military capacity, the Chinese military capacity seem inferior due to quantity and quality. By 2020, the Chinese Navy has accomplished of around 330 surface ships with around 60 to 7 submarines. However, these ships are mostly from the Soviet era and also indigenously built. These include frigate, cruiser, and destroyer, but now they have been upgraded with the anti-aircraft radar and advanced anti-ship missile. China have one operational aircraft carrier with 3 more under construction. However, it has some naval facility at the artificial island in order to further and extend those naval assets. The center of the A280 is the rocket forces. The Chinese have maintained a fleet of anti-medium range ballistic missile, mainly the F-21, which designed specifically in order to destroy and neutralize any surface ship, mainly to target the aircraft carrier. And all of these are accompanied with integrated air defense system on the artificial island, such as the S-300 and HQ-9, which can detect the enemy at from around 300 miles away. So before we move on to the actual conflict, there are some conditions that we should take a look. So many scholars have agreed that actually if the United States and China would not actually fire upon each other, the military escalation can happen because of miscalculation or some intervention by the United States to aid its allies. Because of nuclear weapon between the two will not be used because due to the reason of mutual destruction, and then because of the inferiority both economic and military, China would not seek a protracted conflict between the United States and China. And also U.S. allies stationed in Japan and Australia can also help in support in some way to the military operation of the United States. So let's move on to the scenario and strategy itself. The anti-access area denial are divided, the anti-access for the long-range defense are divided into three main phases with the range of 600, 2,000 and 3,300 kilometers. The initial Chinese defense would, through the attack on all domains such as cyber, electronic and also anti-satellite warfare. For 2,000 and 3,300 kilometers, China would use intermediate range ballistic missile and also other medium range cruise missile which can be launched from the strategic bomber location at the artificial island. So the potential target are the forward operation base of the United States Army and also other supporting facilities such as the command infrastructure, airfield and other. This is for the very first time that Chey, the United States forward operation base can be harmed. So for short-range engagement with area denial are used when the enemy can penetrate the first line of defense or the first island chain. This includes the main chain of air superiority using integrated air defense system and also with the complemented by the Air Force which taken off from the airfield on this artificial island. And the PLAN fleet can equip with a kinetic strike using anti-ship cruise missile with the engagement to U.S. naval forces. So to counter this, the United States can be proceed with some way. So as mentioned earlier, China would have a long-range strike, so that the United States would have to withstand a long-range attack with China and evacuate its remaining personnel before gather those remaining personnel for a consolidation to counter-attack in order to regain superiority both by air and by sea. These also include the the conduct of sea air operation using a penetrative stealth aircraft and long-range strategic bomber in order to put a stress on the mobile launcher and also air defense system. And the United States also tried to penetrate the enemy defense line using submarine warfare and form ad hoc group between the bomber and also naval assets. So in conclusion, as presented earlier, the South China Sea lay a significant advantage between the two countries that all interest cannot be lost. However, there are still some policy recommendations possible to ease up and to mitigate any miscalculation. Both countries, the United States and China, can work bilaterally through a joint commission mechanism to ensure and to form a guideline to prevent any miscalculation or a manual for the maneuver on high sea. And this China also have to ensure the United States that the capacity on those in the region are for defensive purpose only and not used for offensive or with the wish to harm other allies. Other mechanisms such as can be used through ASEAN mechanism because ASEAN so far with the South China Sea issue has come up with the implementation of DOC and also the blueprint for COC and use because of the strategic importance and status of ASEAN toward the United States and China. These two countries can work through the third party such as ASEAN in order to work it. And also in COC, in DOC there is a manual and a guidance in which to counter and to tell the naval asset on high sea on the event that a coincident engagement or a coincident meeting between the naval asset between the two in order to mitigate and also prevent any miscalculation between the two. And thank you. That is all for my presentation.
methodologies. You put in the, you write here, say, you try to construct a practical scenario based on extensive investigation and inquiry of archival and academic experience. And through my reading throughout this I haven't found a single source from any archive. This is what the question. You could elaborate on that. My second question, in the literature review, through my reading of the book, I just wonder why you haven't touched on Sun Tzu book, on the 13th chapter of Sun Tzu, which, from my understanding, I think it's reflects the PLA doctrine in any times of crisis. And my third question is, in your own word, how can South China Sea benefit China in terms of crisis, which is hyperlimited?
So thank you so much, lecturer, for your question. So for the first question, in which that the methodology included the inquiry toward archive from previous, actually in the writing, I have included a formulate through a past naval engagement of the experiences between the two parties in the region. So for China, actually, the naval engagement of the PLAN has been a little bit limited compared to the experience of the United States. The United States, through the naval engagement, it has been presented itself, especially more notably, especially after during the World War II, which include the use of the aircraft carrier, the use of counter strategy, a counter maneuver, because similar thing happened during the time, because during World War II that Japan also tried to use similar strategy through the attack on Pearl Harbor, that they try to disable, to prevent that they destroy on Pearl Harbor, and then they try to prevent the naval asset from the American in order to enter the Western Pacific. However, at the time, the mistake of the Japan is that they failed to destroy the aircraft carrier or the fuel depot. And at the time, the United States have counterattacked using its naval air asset, and also with the combination of marine through the island hopping campaign in order to win back. So those similar experiences can be applied through, have been evolved in similar manner to current doctrine. And for China, actually, the archival engagement in its modern era, because the PLAN has actually been modernized, significantly modernized in the late 18th, early 90s. One significant engagement in the recent year, especially with the counter with the United States, is that it experiences through the Third Taiwan Strait crisis, which at the time the United States have shown its naval forces to enter the region, and that made the CCP came to mind that it need a modernized and also a modernized navy in order to project its power in the region. And move to the literature review on the use of Sun Tzu through the 13th chapter of The Art of War. In some way, in some way of the application of the strategy it has some similar manner to Sun Tzu. For example, that the use of intelligent warfare of the 13th chapter, it also have been conducted through the A2AD, especially with the A2 of its cyber attack, in order to obtain information and disable infrastructure. And moreover, the sensor is actually used as an umbrella, more likely toward to give flow to the ASB and A2AD to counter, especially to learn from your enemy, such as that A2AD, because A2AD is a new doctrine that is applied, that the PLAN has learned from other countries, such as the Soviet experiences in the region through the containment. So in some way, it shares some similarity with sensor. And the South China, and how can South China Sea benefit China in time of crisis? These have been touched upon in the presentation, such as mentioned earlier, that South China Sea have provided a ground for China to construct it in the surveillance system, to construct a radar and reconnaissance which can monitor and to give it an edge on information, whether or not to know whether the enemy can come. And furthermore, because of mentioned earlier that the PLAN and also with Air Force have the inferiority a little bit compared to the United States, and it has lack of aircraft carrier, so that the artificial island constructed on the South China Sea can use as a landing, a supporting facility to extend the range of its aircraft, of its naval asset in time of crisis to continue the fight. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir.
Of course, from the literature on A2AD, I think most of the pictures of the A2AD actually are drawn, practically drawn from the Sun Tzu book. But I think at least you have some kind of reference, because Sun Tzu's book actually published in long time, in the fifth century. And this A2AD, the work of A2AD was quite a recent book, and practically mostly drawn from Sun Tzu's book, as already reason on the reference and developing this one. I think in the literature, I think we should have included at least some of those. And on point 7.3, on the use of AD, air sea battle strategies, you mostly include, I think only either the strategies and tactical move from the bases nearby in the first island chain. But there's a new literature and recently a new announcement from the U.S. Chief of Staff on the successful tested supersonic missile, which is a strategic move against the A2AD adopted quite recently. And I think this is really has a could be a change into the strategies of the U.S. response in times of crisis in order to, overcome the A2A. I think that could be that would somehow change, the description of the scenario in this case.
Okay, yes.
Basically, don't have a lot of questions. Actually, I have a few comments.
Yes.
First thing, if you want to improve Sun Tzu, I think it's better if you try to see, whenever there is a writing about the China, the writing from Chinese scholar related to the anti-access area denial. Let's see if they reference Sun Tzu, and then take the thing that they have referenced. Yeah, but instead of using your own idea, which might not be the thing that they said.
Yes.
But I think the term anti-access area denial itself, maybe a Western.
It's a Western.
Yeah, describe
Yes.
China's action. You have to be clear what does China call it? Right?
Access.
And I think in terms of methodology, I think as already pointed out, I think we have discussed during our discussion stage that we should, if possible, you should steer clear from the scenario what we call the war game.
Yes.
Say, okay, here is the what we call the blue team, the red team, and in hypothetical scenario, we don't have the time to or the resources to conduct a study on that. Okay? So it's better to steer clear from that. Right? And that is a methodology, okay, but it's quite sophisticated and requires special study to do that. So I think you can just take that things out, okay?
Yeah.
And to complement it instead, to compensate that, you should focus on the role of the South China Sea. Okay? Just like the topic, okay? You can talk about all these things, what will happen, but what is the role of the South China Sea? That is something that you should focus on. For example, one role is supposed to provide a platform on which you can install the infrastructure and can support the anti-access and area denial. The second thing is that it is the breakout, you might say the breakout place from the first and the second island chain. Okay, because the Chinese, okay, a quick question. Okay, one of the biggest or the most important Chinese submarine base.
Hainan.
Yeah, that is around the area of the South China Sea.
Yes.
Right? So in a type of passage, you want a place where you can break out, and expand and go everywhere. Because if you are concentrated in one place, it just makes it easy for the enemy to attack. Okay?
Yes.
So these are the main advantage of the South China Sea. Okay, so be clear from that scenario thing. Okay.
Yes.
Instead, focus on the advantage of the South China Sea.
Yes.
Okay? Because most of the study kind of not directly touch on that. Right?
Yes.
Another thing about in terms of methodology, when you say archival, again, unfortunately, they're not going to do that. And when you talk about archive in this context of warfare, where a lot of tactics are involved, you have to understand the difference in technology.
Yes.
Whether the technology consisting of something that continues from the past. If you focus on Sun Tzu, then not a lot of things has changed, because that is at strategic level. Once you go down to the technical level, you start to see things like the military revolution or the revolution in military affairs, things like that. It's complex, and like the case that you bring, like the World War II. Okay, you have to understand what things that World War II Navy did not have is electronic warfare. Okay, in the past you want to go find aircraft carrier, just fly around and see. Okay, that's aircraft carrier. But today you have electronic warfare, so maybe the archive might not work. Another statement that you said that you don't see a lot of cases for China. Actually, China had a major engagement in the South China Sea. That was in 1974, the battle of the Paracel Islands, where China took
Vietnam.
the Paracel Island from South Vietnam.
Yeah, from Vietnam.
South Vietnam was better equipped because their navy was designed based on American standard. And then China, reeling from the Cultural Revolution, so most of their fleet were focused up north, in the Taiwan Strait and Japan. And when you have the crisis, China get together a small fleet, of fishing vessel, minesweeper, and some ship that cannot be compared with the South Vietnamese, and yet they could win. Okay? And most of the Chinese writing actually draw a lot from their battles.
Yeah.
So that's how you can make it a bit more. But take off that scenario.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think one point of the literature should focus on elaborating on symmetrical warfare,
Yeah.
which I think is related to something we work as well. In the Chinese saying, I forgot now, but literally it translated, you know your enemy's weakness, you know your enemy's strength, and in order to defeat a stronger person, you attack his weakness. That's in Chinese. That's one. And literally, I talked to quite a number of Chinese officers. From one to another, they keep talking about poking one eye, poking, the enemy's eyes.
Yes.
Which you also relate. You don't relate it to, but you mentioned about electronic warfare,
Yeah.
about the space satellite warfare, the disruption to the communication systems of the enemy.
Yes.
I think that's that's one way or another could be found in the PLA thinking in times of crisis.
Yes.
Do you want to talk about estimated warfare? We can also revise it.
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, lecturers and Rasmay. We still have one more presentation left. However, before moving to the last presentation of the day, we will have a 10 minutes break. Thank you and see you again soon.